By December 21st, Peiper was surrounded at La Glaise, his tanks immobile, dead weight. The American forces surrounding him, 30th Infantry Division, 82nd Airborne, 3rd Armored, had a combined fuel allocation of 340,000 gallons for December 21st alone. Peiper had perhaps 1,000 gallons left. Private First Class. Richard McKinney wrote home that week. His letter passed through censors because it seemed like dark humor. "We've got Germans surrounded who ran out of gas. Our captain jokes we use more fuel heating coffee than they have for their tanks." It wasn't a joke. The American response to the Ardennes demonstrated industrial warfare at its peak. Patton's Third Army pivot north, considered impossible by German standards, required 350,000 gallons just for redeployment. Accomplished in 3 days. December the 23rd brought clear weather. Allied aircraft flew 2,000 sorties, each burning fuel at rates that would have grounded the Luftwaffe for weeks. P-47. Thunderbolts consumed 300 gallons per hour in combat. B-26 Marauders burned 200 gallons per hour. One day's air operations consumed more fuel than Germany's entire Ardennes allocation. On the night of December 23rd to 24th, Peiper made the only decision he could. He abandoned his vehicles, escaped on foot. Of 119 tanks and assault guns that began the offensive with Kampfgruppe Peiper, 39 remained operational, all immobilized by empty fuel tanks. These were destroyed with the remaining ammunition, blown up by their own crews. Oberscharführer Heinz Goltz described the scene years later, his voice still hollow. "We drained the last fuel from all vehicles, maybe 200 gallons total. The Obersturmbannführer personally destroyed his command tank, millions of Reichsmarks of equipment, destroyed by empty fuel tanks. Of 5,000 men who began with Kampfgruppe Peiper, approximately 770 returned. They had advanced 60 miles, captured several depots, and discovered the truth about Allied logistics." News of Peiper's discoveries spread rapidly through German command. On December 26th, Field Marshal Walter Model received detailed reports on captured American supplies. His Chief of Staff recorded Model's reaction. The Field Marshal read the quantities twice. 50,000 gallons at Honsfeld, 2 million burned at Stavelot, 8 million destroyed rather than captured. He looked up and said, "We are not fighting the same war." Hitler, informed on December 28th, refused to accept reality. Speer later wrote, Hitler insisted the numbers were propaganda. When shown photographs of burning Stavelot, he claimed it was Hollywood effects. But the lower ranks understood. Grenadier Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote to his wife, the letter intercepted by German censors and flagged for investigation. "Americans destroy more fuel daily than we receive monthly. They drive tanks like we march. This war is lost." The fuel crisis was symptomatic of a larger truth. By 1944, America produced 50% of the world's manufacturing output. A new aircraft rolled off assembly lines every 5 minutes. A ship launched daily. A tank completed every 7 minutes. The petroleum production statistics were overwhelming. United States, 1.8 billion barrels. Soviet Union, 110 million barrels. Germany, including synthetic, 33 million barrels. Japan, 2.6 million barrels. The Axis combined produced less than 2% of American petroleum output. Every major German offensive after 1942 had been constrained by fuel. Every American offensive was supported by abundance. German planners literally couldn't conceive. Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hansen recorded a revealing incident on December 27th. A logistics officer reported that bad weather had reduced fuel deliveries to only 500,000 gallons daily. There was brief concern until someone noted this exceeded Germany's total offensive allocation for the entire Ardennes. German prisoners from the Ardennes were more shocked by American waste than by firepower, seeing GIs discard half-eaten rations, using gasoline to heat water for shaving, leaving engines running for warmth. It shattered morale more effectively than artillery. Obergefreiter Hans Reichhelm told interrogators something that would be repeated by dozens of other German POWs. "We knew your production numbers abstractly. but seeing soldiers waste more than we possessed, that made them real. Every German who saw your casual abundance knew the war was hopeless. This knowledge spread through letters home despite censorship. Feldwebel Ernst Müller wrote, the letter was intercepted but deemed less dangerous than keeping the truth contained. Americans wash their vehicles with gasoline. They feed chocolate to dogs. They fire artillery for Christmas celebrations. We cannot fight infinity. The psychological impact undermined decades of German propaganda about racial superiority. How could the supposedly decadent Americans possess such wealth while the master, race scraped for necessities? During the Nuremberg trials, German leaders consistently cited logistics, particularly fuel, as the decisive factor. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel testified, "We had operational superiority from 1940 to 41. By 1944, we couldn't move forces for lack of fuel, while Americans moved entire armies like chess pieces." Peiper, on trial, for the Malmedy massacre, offered testimony that was both defense and confession. Every decision after December 17th was influenced by fuel shortage. We couldn't maneuver, couldn't pursue, couldn't retreat effectively. Americans moved freely while we counted liters. General Heinz Guderian wrote in his memoirs, when Peiper captured 50,000 gallons, meaning everything to him but nothing to Americans, the war was already over. The story resonates because it represents the moment when industrial warfare reached its logical conclusion. Wars would be won by production statistics, not warrior courage. The romantic notion of warfare died in the Ardennes among empty fuel tanks and burning depots. Dr. Richard Overy calculated that by 1944, Allied to Axis production ratios exceeded 5-to-1 in major categories. In petroleum, it approached 50-to-1. These advantages couldn't be overcome by superior training, or brilliant tactics, or warrior spirit. America produced 324,750 aircraft during the war. Germany built 119,907. Americans manufactured 88,410 tanks. Germany produced 46,857, but most tellingly, America refined 1.8 billion barrels of oil in 1944 alone. Germany scraped together 33 million barrels. December the 24th, 1944. As Peiper's men slipped through American lines on foot, abandoning 39 tanks, 70 half-tracks, and 177 other vehicles, the magnitude of what they'd discovered finally crystallized. They had captured 50,000 gallons, celebrated it like winning the lottery, only to learn it was meaningless to an enemy who could burn millions without hesitation. Unteroffizier Werner reflected in a 1975 interview, his voice still carrying the weight of betrayal. That morning at Honsfeld, finding American fuel, we celebrated like we'd won the war. By evening, learning about Stavelot burning, we understood we'd already lost. Americans had so much they could destroy what we would die to possess. The 50,000 gallons Peiper captured was less than a single American armored division consumed in 2 days. Less than the Red Ball Express burned in 3 hours of operation, a rounding error in Allied daily consumption. Major General J. Lawton Collins later wrote, "The Germans' desperate attempts to capture fuel revealed their fundamental miscalculation. They assumed we valued fuel as they did, as irreplaceable. They couldn't comprehend we had so much we could burn, millions, rather than risk the slightest tactical disadvantage. Operation Watch on the Rhine failed through the immutable mathematics of industrial warfare. The offensive consumed approximately 2.8 million gallons. 40% came from captured supplies, the difference between catastrophe and merely disastrous failure. During the same period, Americans consumed 267 million gallons, nearly 100 times more. The Wehrmacht lost 100,000 men, 800 tanks, 1,000 aircraft. But most devastating was the loss of illusions. Every German soldier who witnessed American abundance understood with crushing clarity Germany wasn't fighting a war anymore. It was participating in its own execution. Joachim Peiper survived the war, imprisoned until 1956 for war crimes. On July 14, 1976, he was murdered at his home in France by unknown assailants. The killers were never found, but in 1967, he told historian Henry Lehman something that captures the horror of that December morning. Finding that depot was the worst thing that could have happened. If we'd run out of fuel earlier, we might have retreated with dignity. Instead, we discovered Americans had oceans while we had drops. We discovered impossibility. The lesson extends far beyond World War II. In industrial warfare, logistics supersedes tactics. Production overwhelms courage. Abundance defeats dedication. The German soldier of 1944 was arguably better trained and more experienced than his American counterpart. It didn't matter. Americans were backed by an industrial machine that could waste more than Germany could produce. This truth was encoded in every jerrycan at Honsfeld, every gallon burned at Stavelot, every pipeline snaking across France. Wars between industrial powers would be won in factories and refineries, not by brilliant generals on battlefields. Colonel Trevor Dupuy calculated that in December 1944, each American soldier was supported by 67 pounds of supplies daily. Each German soldier received 3 pounds. Americans complained about waste and inefficiency. Germans would have considered American waste unimaginable abundance. In 1984, 40 years after the battle, veterans gathered at L'Église for a memorial ceremony. The museum there displays Peiper's Tiger tank, still positioned exactly where it ran out of fuel on December 23, 1944. Former Unteroffizier Karl Wortmann stood beside the tank with former Staff Sergeant Roy Anderson of the 30th Infantry Division. Two old men, looking at a monument to futility. "We always wondered why you stopped," Anderson said quietly. "We thought it was tactical," Wortmann laughed. "But there was no humor in it. We stopped because the tanks were empty. You burned millions of gallons to keep it from us. How could we fight that?" Anderson was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that captured the entire tragedy. "We never knew you were that short. We had so much. We never even thought about it." That exchange captured the truth of December 1944. One side measured by the gallon, the other by millions. One side fought for each jerry can. The other burned oceans. The outcome was predetermined. German records provide damning evidence in cold. Bureaucratic precision, Army Group B's War Diary, December 1944. December 16th. Offensive begins. Fuel at 70% of minimum required. December 17th. Peiper captures 50,000 gallons. December 18th. Multiple depots destroyed by enemy. 5+ million gallons lost. December 19th. Fuel situation critical. Units immobilized. December 24th. Peiper abandons vehicles. Fuel exhaustion. Meanwhile, First Army reports. December 16th. Reserves at 3.7 million gallons. December 17th. 2.2 million gallons destroyed to deny enemy. December 18th. 1.8 million gallons received. December 24th. Reserves at 4.1 million gallons. The Americans treated millions of gallons with casual indifference. Germans rationed individual cans like liquid gold. Beyond mere quantity, American fuel represented technological superiority Germany couldn't match. American refineries had perfected catalytic cracking, producing higher octane more efficiently than German hydrogenation. American 100-octane aviation fuel gave aircraft performance advantages over German planes running 87-octane synthetic. American engineers perfected additives Germany couldn't replicate. Tetraethyl lead, ethylene dibromide, detergents and stabilizers. German engines designed for lower quality fuel often ran poorly on captured American gasoline. The irony was almost poetic. Fuel shortage shaped every soldier's experience in ways that went beyond tactical considerations. Gefreiter Hans Müller recorded on December 20th, marched 30 kilometers today. No fuel for trucks. Past abandoned American vehicles with engines still running for warmth. They leave engines running. We marched through snow. Medical services were crippled. Ambulances couldn't evacuate wounded. Field hospitals couldn't run generators for surgery. Men died waiting for transportation that never came. Oberarzt Dr. Wilhelm Kirsting testified at a post-war inquiry. We had excellent surgeons, medical supplies captured from Americans, but no fuel for ambulances. Men died from treatable wounds who could have been saved with 10 kilometers of transport. The discoveries at places like Honsfeld shattered German propaganda about American weakness and decadence. Soldiers had been told for years that Americans were soft, incapable of real sacrifice. Then they discovered Americans could destroy more than Germany possessed. Goebbels' diary, December 28th. Reports indicate serious morale problems. Soldiers writing home about American material superiority, undermining our narrative of racial and ideological supremacy. But the stories spread faster than censorship could contain them. The myth of German superiority couldn't survive. Contact with American logistics. After the Ardennes failure, Germany had no options left except desperate defense. General Alfred Jodl testified at Nuremberg, "After the Ardennes, we knew it was finished. We had played our last card and discovered the enemy held all the aces." Recognizing German desperation, the Allies focused on systematically destroying what little fuel production remained. By February 1945, German fuel production had effectively ceased. The Luftwaffe was grounded. Training cancelled. Elite pilots sat idle while American and British aircraft ruled the skies unopposed. The Wehrmacht became static, destroyed piecemeal. By mobile enemies it could no longer maneuver against. Spring 1945 brought surreal scenes. German units surrendered from immobility, not military defeat. Entire panzer divisions sat helplessly as Allied columns drove past. General Major Fritz Bayerlein described the end. "We had 42 operational tanks, experienced crews, plenty of ammunition. We had 300 liters of fuel, not enough to reach the next town. We destroyed our own tanks and walked into captivity." Meanwhile, the American advance was constrained only by traffic jams from vehicle abundance. Patton's Third Army alone operated 15,000 vehicles. Kampfgruppe Peiper's fuel crisis demonstrates how industrial capacity determined World War II's outcome more than any other single factor. When Peiper stood among those captured jerry cans that December morning, he glimpsed a truth that would haunt him until his death. They were fighting an enemy whose waste exceeded their need. The numbers tell everything you need to know. German offensive allocation, 5 million gallons. Fuel destroyed by Americans to deny capture, 8 million gallons. Daily American consumption, 7.5 million gallons. Peiper's capture at Honsfeld, 50,000 gallons. Percentage of American daily supply, 0.6%. The Battle of the Bulge killed 19,000 Americans, perhaps 100,000 Germans. It destroyed the Wehrmacht's last reserves, but its lasting impact was spreading knowledge through German ranks like a virus. Knowledge that couldn't be contained or denied. America possessed incomprehensible abundance. Peiper's discovery wasn't just about fuel. It was about the nature of industrial warfare itself. Victory belonged to whoever produced the most petroleum, the most steel, the most aluminum. Germany never had a chance. The final irony came when American forces catalogued abandoned German equipment at La Glaise. They found 39 perfectly functional tanks. Tigers and Panthers, the pride of German engineering, abandoned solely for lack of fuel. Major Robert Harrison's salvage report noted the absurdity with bureaucratic precision. Fuel required to recover and operate vehicles, 8,000 gallons. Classification, minimal request. Source, local reserve stocks. Estimated time, 4 hours. What was impossible for the Germans, 8,000 gallons to save their best tanks, was beneath American notice. A minor requisition, using local reserves. Processed in an afternoon. 4 hours to accomplish what Kampfgruppe Peiper couldn't achieve in 8 days of desperate combat. This was Peiper's discovery at Honsfeld. Not just that America had more fuel, but that American abundance operated on a scale that made German scarcity completely irrelevant. The war had been over, the moment American industrial capacity fully mobilized. Honsfeld simply revealed what had been true since 1942. Germany was fighting the impossible. Measuring. Defeat in gallons, while America measured. Victory in oceans. The Tiger tank still sits in La Glazes Museum today. Fuel gauge reading empty. Monument to the moment when tactical excellence met logistical reality, and lost. Visitors ask the same question, year after year, in a dozen different languages. Why were such powerful tanks abandoned? The answer is simple, brutal, final. No fuel. The engine that once roared with 700 horses of German engineering now sits silent, frozen in time. December 23rd, 1944. The day Joachim Peiper and 5,000 of Germany's elite soldiers discovered what their leaders had known but refused to accept. They weren't fighting a war. They could win. They were burning the last drops in a tank that had run dry months before. And across the fields of Belgium, across the forests of the Ardennes, the Americans kept moving, engines running, tanks rolling, supplied by an industrial machine that treated millions of gallons the way Germany treated individual cans. The mathematics were always inevitable. The outcome was never in doubt. All that remained was for men like Peiper to discover it for themselves. One frozen morning in December, standing among pyramids of jerry cans. Olive, drab, American, full, and utterly, completely meaningless against the tide of abundance that would wash over Europe in the months to come. That day didn't just change the offensive. It didn't just change the war. It changed every German soldier who lived to tell the story, the ones who saw what their enemy could casually destroy. The ones who counted liters while Americans burned oceans. The ones who finally understood the war was already over. They just hadn't stopped fighting yet. Distant artillery fades into winter silence. The fires at Stavelot have long since turned to ash, but the lesson remains. Carved into empty fuel gauges and abandoned tanks, written in the smoke that rose 1,000 feet over Belgium, whispered in the wind that still cuts through the Ardennes forest. Some wars are decided by courage, some by strategy, some by the will of soldiers who refuse to break. But this one was decided by petroleum, by pipelines and refineries and tanker convoys crossing any ocean, by an industrial capacity so vast it could afford to burn what the enemy would die to possess, by the simple, terrible mathematics of abundance versus scarcity. And on a frozen morning in December 1944, a German officer stood among thousands of captured fuel cans and finally understood. They had already lost. Not that day, not that week, but months before, years before. The moment Germany chose to fight an enemy who measured victory in oceans. While they counted drops, the guns have fallen, silent, but their echoes still whisper across these hills, telling a story about the day the Third Reich discovered it had already lost. The Maybach engine choked once, twice. Then, silence. December 17th, 1944. 5:30 in the morning. The hills outside Honsfeld, Belgium, and the most powerful armored column Germany could still muster, sat frozen in the dark. SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper pressed his gloved fist against the turret hatch. The metal rang out, cold and hollow, swallowed by the fog. Below him, his driver cranked the ignition again. 700 horses of German engineering, all of it dead weight now. The fuel gauge didn't lie, empty. Peiper's voice cut through the intercom, sharp and low. Status. From the driver's compartment came a voice he barely recognized. Tight, strangled, the kind of panic soldiers try to bury. "Reserve tank is dry, sir," completely dry. Peiper climbed down, boots hitting frozen ground with a crunch that seemed too loud. Around him, stretched out in the pre-dawn mist, sat the pride of the Wehrmacht's winter gamble. 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, nearly 5,000 of Germany's most elite Waffen-SS soldiers, all of them paralyzed. Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Ardennes offensive. Hitler's last great roll of the dice. And before the sun even rose on day 2, it was already choking on fumes. Peiper walked forward slowly, his breath fogging in the December air. Through the haze, he could see the American position ahead. Honsfeld, a supply depot for the US 99th Infantry Division. The Americans had left in a hurry. Fires still flickered in oil drums. Coffee steamed from tin cups, abandoned mid-sip. And there, lined up in perfect rows, like a cruel joke from the gods of war, thousands of jerry cans. Olive drab. American. Full. Peiper approached them as if they might disappear. His adjutant, Hans Gruller, pried one open and sniffed. Benzene. High-octane gasoline. The real thing. His men swarmed the depot like ants on sugar, frantic, desperate, pouring American fuel into German tanks. Peiper stood among the stockpile, counting, doing the math. 50,000 gallons, enough to fuel his entire battle group all the way to the Meuse River. Enough to maybe, just maybe, change the course of this offensive. More fuel than most German divisions had seen in 6 months. The Americans had just left it. And as Peiper stood there, watching his soldiers pour enemy gasoline into the veins of the Third Reich's war machine, something settled over him. Heavy. Cold. Inevitable. If the Americans could afford to abandon this much, if they could leave, behind what Germany would guard with entire armies, then this war was already over. 6 months earlier, June 1944, Berlin. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, had walked into the Führer's office with a report that should have ended all offensive planning immediately. The numbers were brutal. Undeniable. Germany's synthetic fuel production, the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht, had been systematically annihilated by Allied bombing. The Lunar Works, which had churned out 175,000 tons of fuel in April, managed barely 5,000 tons by September. The hydrogenation plants at Pülitz, Blechhammer, Brucks, operating at less than 10% capacity. Some had stopped completely. The statistics told a story that German leadership refused to hear. In 1944, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude, oiled Germany, including all synthetic production, and the captured Romanian oil fields managed 33 million barrels. Less than 2% of American output. The Third Reich was trying to wage mechanized warfare with horse-drawn logistics. America was drowning its armies in petroleum, and somewhere in the gap between those two realities, the war had already been decided. Major Friedrich Zimmer of the Wehrmacht's Logistics Command had done the calculations. The Ardennes offensive would require 4.5 million gallons of fuel just to reach Antwerp. Hitler allocated 5 million gallons, barely enough, even on paper. Only half of it was actually delivered. The German High Command was betting everything on capturing enemy supplies, a strategy that didn't reveal strength. It revealed terminal weakness. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the Americans had built something Germany couldn't even comprehend. Pipeline systems snaking across France. The Pluto system, pipeline under the ocean, pumping fuel directly from England. The Red Ball Express, a convoy system so massive it delivered 12,500 tons of supplies to the front every single day. By December 1944, American forces in Europe were burning through 1.2 million gallons of fuel daily and receiving 1.4 million. They were accumulating reserves while fighting. Joachim Peiper was not a fool. At 29, he was one of the youngest regimental commanders in the Waffen-SS, holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, a veteran of the Eastern Front, where he'd learned the hardest lesson of modern warfare. Fuel was more precious than ammunition. His Kampfgruppe had been designated the Schwerpunkt, the decisive spearhead of the entire Ardennes offensive. On December 14th, 2 days before the attack, he'd sat in the final briefing at Tondorf. General Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 6th SS Panzer Army, had been blunt, almost cruel in his honesty. "You will have enough fuel to reach the Meuse if you capture American supplies. Peiper's fuel allocation, 31,000 gallons, enough for 50 miles of combat operations. The distance to the Meuse, 65 miles. The mathematics of failure were baked into the plan from the beginning. As his column prepared to roll out on December 16th, Peiper issued orders that would have seemed absurd just 2 years earlier. Tanks would move in single file to conserve fuel. Engines would shut down during any halt longer than 5 minutes. And the capture of American fuel depots was priority 1, above even tactical objectives. The contrast with American operations that same morning was almost obscene. Captain James Ross of the US 743rd Tank Battalion, stationed just 20 miles away, recorded in his unit diary, "Received fuel resupply, 8,000 gallons, third delivery this week. Storage tanks already at capacity." Storage tanks already full. December 16th, 5:30 a.m. The German artillery barrage that opened Operation Watch on the Rhine used more ammunition in 2 hours than the Wehrmacht had allocated for entire operations earlier in the war. But even that impressive display masked a deeper rot. Peiper's column began moving at 7 a.m., already behind schedule. The roads, which appeared as highways on German maps, were narrow country lanes, many unpaved. Within hours, traffic jams choked the advance as vehicles designed for the Russian steppes struggled through the dense Ardennes forest. At Lanzerath, the first objective, they ran into unexpected resistance. A single American intelligence and reconnaissance platoon. 18 men. They held up the most powerful German armored column for nearly 10 hours. During the delay, Peiper's vehicle sat there, idling, burning precious fuel. When they finally broke through and reached Honsfeld at dawn on December 17th, the math was already damning. 20 miles covered, 40% of their fuel consumed. At this rate, they'd run dry before reaching the halfway point. The American supply depot at Honsfeld wasn't even a primary facility. It was classified as a Class 3B. Depot, a temporary forward fuel station for the 99th Infantry Division. And yet what? Peiper found there exceeded the monthly allocation for an entire German panzer. Division Hans Gruller Lata testified at Nuremberg about what they discovered. "We found pyramids of jerry cans, each one containing 5 gallons of gasoline. They were stacked 3 meters high, extending for maybe 200 meters. The Americans hadn't even tried to destroy them. The captured fuel was high-octane aviation gas mixed with motor fuel, 80 octane or higher. German vehicles, especially the temperamental Maybach engines in the Tiger tanks, were designed for 74 octane fuel. The American gasoline was actually too good. It caused engine problems in several German vehicles. As Peiper's men refueled, they kept finding things. Small details that added up to something horrifying. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann discovered shipping manifests in the depot office. He could read English. He'd worked in his father's import business before the war. The papers told a story that made his stomach turn. This fuel had been shipped from Texas to New York, across the Atlantic to Liverpool, across the Channel to Normandy, then trucked 400 miles to Honsfeld, a journey of over 6,000 miles, completed in less than 6 weeks. I showed the papers to Lieutenant Colonel Peiper, Hoffmann recalled in a 1976 interview. His voice still carried the weight of it 30 years later. He read them twice, then crumpled them up. He said nothing, but his face went pale. We both understood what it meant. Private Ernst Bauer found a stack of Stars and Stripes newspapers, dated December 15th, just 2 days old. The headline celebrated the opening of a new fuel pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun, capable of delivering 300,000 gallons per day, a single pipeline, delivering more fuel daily than Kampfgruppe Peiper would use in the entire offensive. To understand the shock of what Peiper discovered that morning, you have to understand Germany's fuel situation by late 1944. Since May, Allied bombing had reduced synthetic fuel production by 90%. The Luftwaffe was grounding aircraft. Pilot training had been slashed from 250 flight hours to 60. New pilots were being sent up practically blind. The German Navy's surface fleet had effectively ceased operations. U-boats were being fitted with snorkels to conserve diesel by running on batteries as long as possible. On the home front, German civilians hadn't seen private automobile traffic since 1942. Gasoline was so precious, the Gestapo investigated black market theft of individual litres. Farmers were returning to horse-drawn ploughs. Meanwhile, the United States was producing 67% of the world's oil. The East Texas oil field alone, just one field, produced more petroleum than all of German-occupied Europe combined. American refineries were operating at such capacity that Standard Oil was experimenting with new petroleum byproducts simply because they had excess crude to play with. Excess. With the 50,000 gallons captured at Honsfeld. Peiper's column surged forward. They reached Billingen by noon on December 17th. Captured more supplies, rations, ammunition, and most importantly, maps showing other American fuel depots in the area. But the maps revealed something disturbing. The Americans had fuel stockpiles everywhere. Every major crossroads had a depot. The US First Army alone had 3.5 million gallons in reserve. Peiper pushed on toward Ligneville, where his forces would commit the Malmedy massacre, killing 84 American prisoners. Even that war crime was connected to fuel desperation. Peiper later claimed he couldn't spare the gasoline to transport prisoners. By evening, on December 17th, Peiper's spearhead reached Stavelot, site of a major American fuel depot, over 2 million gallons. Here was enough fuel to guarantee reaching the Meuse, maybe even beyond. But as the first German vehicles approached through the twilight, American engineers were already at work. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had received warning of the German approach. His orders were simple: deny fuel to the enemy. At all costs, the Stavelot depot contained 2,189,000 gallons of gasoline, stored in jerry cans stacked across 15 acres. At 4:30 p.m. on December 17th, as Peiper's advance guard closed in, Captain Brewster gave the order. Engineers poured gasoline trails between the stacks. White phosphorus grenades were distributed. Technical Sergeant Paul Hinkle threw the first grenade. The explosion was immediate and tremendous, he recalled decades later. A wall of fire shot up maybe 100 feet. Within minutes, the entire depot was an inferno. Peiper's lead tanks arrived to find a pillar of black smoke rising 1,000 feet into the winter sky. The fire would burn for 3 days, consuming enough fuel to have powered Peiper's entire division to Antwerp and back. Twice. Unteroffizier Werner described the scene. The Obersturmbannführer stood on his tank turret, watching the flames. He said nothing for maybe 5 minutes. Just stood there. Then he climbed down and told me, "They can afford to burn 2 million gallons to deny them to us. What are we doing here?" Across the Ardennes, American engineers were destroying fuel dumps rather than risk capture. At Trois Ponts, 1.1 million gallons burned. At Spa, 2.5 million gallons destroyed. In total, Americans deliberately destroyed over 8 million gallons during the first week of the offensive. More than Germany had allocated for the entire operation. The ability to casually incinerate millions of gallons was rooted in a supply system beyond German comprehension. The Red Ball Express had delivered 412,000 tons of supplies using 6,000 trucks operating around the clock. Each truck consumed 40 gallons daily just to operate. The logistics operation itself burned more fuel than German Army Group B received in a month. By December 1944, the Motor Transport Service employed 230 truck companies operating on color-coded routes. The system delivered 20,000 tons of supplies daily, including 3,000 tons of fuel. Colonel James Snyder, Chief Logistics Officer for 1st Army, recorded on December 18th. Fuel receipts yesterday. 1,847,000 gallons. Fuel issued 1,623,000 gallons. Net gain to reserves 224,000 gallons. Net gain. during combat operations. The pipeline system was even more impressive. Operation Pluto had laid pipes across the English Channel, pumping 1 million gallons daily from Britain. A network of pipelines extended inland like arteries. The Cherbourg-Paris line delivered 800,000 gallons daily. The Seine line moved 650,000. By December 1944, Allied forces in northwest Europe were consuming 7.5 million gallons daily. While receiving 8.2 million gallons, they were building reserves during offensive operations. As Peiper pushed deeper into Belgium on December 18th, the impossibility of the German position crystallized with every mile. At Chagny, they captured another depot, 5,000 gallons. Consumed in 3 hours of combat, Tiger tanks burned 2.5 gallons per mile in battle. Panthers consumed 1.5 gallons per mile. In the difficult Ardennes terrain, narrow roads, steep hills, constant maneuvering, consumption increased by 40%. Hauptmann Otto Dingler, maintenance officer for the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, recorded the brutal math. By noon on December 18th, we had consumed 67,000 gallons since the offensive began. We had captured perhaps 55,000 gallons. We were operating at a deficit. The Americans, monitoring German radio traffic through ultra-intercepts, knew Peiper's fuel situation. General Courtney Hodges issued orders to all units. Enemy critically short of fuel. Destroy all gasoline stocks threatened by capture. That same day, American C-47s flew 316. Sorties delivering supplies to the surrounded garrison at Bastogne, including 160,000 gallons of fuel. The Americans were flying more fuel to a surrounded town than Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe possessed. By December 19th, as Peiper's forces engaged American defenders at Stoumont, the fuel crisis had become terminal. Tanks were being abandoned with empty fuel tanks, not from battle damage. From empty tanks, Peiper consolidated his remaining fuel, perhaps 8,000 gallons, enough for one engagement, or retreat, but not both. Meanwhile, Allied planners were already preparing for January operations. Brigadier General Maurice Gilland requested 245 million gallons for the coming month. The request was approved without discussion. The contrast extended beyond just quantity. American vehicles were standardized for efficiency. Sherman tanks consumed 0.8 gallons per mile versus the Tiger's 2.5. American trucks got 8 miles per gallon, fully loaded. Parts were interchangeable. Maintenance simplified. German forces operated a bewildering array of captured and manufactured vehicles, each with different requirements. French tanks needed different oil than German Panthers. Soviet trucks required different parts than German Opels. Every complication multiplied the logistical nightmare. On December 20th, Peiper received a radio message that sealed his fate. Fuel convoy destroyed by Allied aircraft. No resupply possible. Continue with available resources. Peiper called his commanders together. The conversation was brief. Sturmbannführer Werner Pötschke was blunt. We have fuel for perhaps 20 kilometers. The Meuse is 30 kilometers away. According to Hauptsturmführer Gruler's testimony years later, the Obersturmbannführer said something that would haunt German survivors for decades. Gentlemen, we have discovered we are fighting an enemy who burns more fuel to deny it to us than we received for this entire operation. What we captured at Honsfeld, which seemed miraculous, was nothing to them. Nothing. We cannot win. This realization was spreading through German ranks like poison. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, later wrote, "When I learned Americans had destroyed 8 million gallons rather than risk our capturing it, I knew the offensive had failed before it began." Colonel Friedrich von der Heydte, captured December 23rd, told Allied interrogators something that would appear in intelligence reports across the Western Front. "Your soldiers throw away chocolate. My men haven't seen chocolate in 2 years. You burn millions of gallons. We measure by the liter. How can we fight such abundance?